Welcome to the VCF Musketeer, another episode for the podcast for all businesses utilizing or planning to utilize VMware Cloud Foundation in one form or the other. In today's episode, we have Martin Hoskin as a guest. Welcome, Martin. Why don't you quickly introduce yourself?
Thanks, Eve. Martin Hoskin, based in the UK. I'm the field CTO for cloud partners at Broadcom. So obviously we have a broad network of partners across Europe and the globe, and I just support them with their go-to-market. A lot around sovereignty at the moment, of course, and VCF and the transition of their infrastructure into the full stack VCF as well. So interesting times.
Yeah, I mean, we have had even some joint events talking to service providers, and actually, over all these years is like, and I mean, I have been going through it all. It's like starting with Cloud Director 1, then moving over with all the different things. Then at one point in time, someone decided to buy Dynamic Ops, and then I had the wonderful experience of actually doing a boot camp for back then VCAC with partners, where 5 minutes before my boot camp, someone told them at the breakfast that Cloud Director will be replaced with VCAC. So that was a wonderful 2 days ahead of VMworld back then. And then we had to actually straighten that back. And then there was silence a bit more about Cloud Director. And then it came back. And now someone declared it dead again. So maybe this time for real is like, or it maybe turns out to be a cat and actually comes back again and again for us. We will certainly see.
I've been at VMware 12 years, so 2014 I started. So most of what you described there, I lived through. The acquisition of Dynamic Ops and VCAC was very early on when I joined. I joined VMware, and we caused a lot of confusion. There's no question about that. Cloud Director was and still is a fantastic product. And we actually caused quite a lot of confusion around the different go-to-markets of Cloud Director and VCAC. We eventually got there. We eventually sorted that out and really had a clear narrative on that. But it did take some time. And the team I worked in at the time actually was, we were charged with, defining those use cases for Cloud Director, defining the use cases for VCAC and what became VRA and then ARIA automation. But it was a challenging time really to really, what works for cloud providers, what works for enterprise customers, and how do they work together, which, again, these two products, which were quite overlapping in many ways, actually trying to integrate them was hugely challenging.
Yeah, and I think now we have a new time under Broadcom, which I think the huge difference between now and then is now there is a very clear and, let's say, very strict roadmap, and it's no longer is like, let's try to just actually build everything. It's more is like, let's focus on a few things and actually make sure that the products do these specific things in the best possible way. That does not necessarily always fit all customers. That's natural if you do that. But I mean, when we look back on some other products in the past, it's like the different attempts. If we take VCF operations nowadays, for example, it's like the different attempts to actually build a management pack for standalone, like I think it was NetApp storages, where you go, it's like, I think maybe it was 1 or 2 customers globally. Does it really make sense to build something for all of these niche corner cases just in the hope that potentially someone shows up for them, or have a very, very solid private cloud and public cloud solution if it's being rolled out by a service provider? And I think overall, the story makes sense. And I mean, the last couple of months have clearly shown there is a huge demand from service providers towards VCF. Many customer discussions are towards VCF. We currently still have to explain to many is like VCF is not only for the ones who have 500 physical hosts, because that is more of the discussion we have. It's like, I'm not that big. Does VCF work for me? Where it goes like, potentially if you only want to do 2 hosts, that's maybe a problem as long as we don't size them big enough. But other than that, it works pretty well. But before we go any further, what would be maybe even with a CSP and sovereign perspective, what would be your like 60 seconds elevator pitch if you run into someone who is not convinced that VMware or VMware Cloud Foundation is really what they should go for to build a private or public cloud platform?
I think when it comes to sovereignty, it isn't a black and white scenario, because everyone has a different interpretation of what sovereignty means. So if I talk to the guys at NATO, for example, and obviously they're very US focused, their idea of digital sovereignty is different than if you talk to the EU Commission about it or other European, public sector. So sovereignty isn't one thing, but what VCF does give you is flexibility in how you deploy it and how you manage it and operate it. And of course, with it all running in your data center or in a cloud provider's data center, you have that automatic boundary of jurisdictional control over data, both at the legal perspective, but also from an operating perspective as well, and who operates those clouds. And at the end of the day, my view on this is that it all comes down to requirements. What are the customer requirements? And does the customer need full legal jurisdiction over that data? And in more and more, highly regulated industries, it's absolutely true that that control over data, who has access to it, do US frameworks apply to my data? And, more and more regulated industries are finding themselves in that trap. So VCF as a product that you deploy and manage and operate all within your own boundaries has some real differentiating factors around that, because, VCF doesn't share any information with Broadcom or VMware folks at all, unlike public cloud, where, Microsoft share that data with the account team and the strategy team, so they understand how to better help you and how to better utilize and consume those workloads. We don't do that because we don't have access to it. We can't do it, fundamentally. So we, whether it's, highly regulated, air-gapped individual environments, which are, completely isolated from a defense perspective or an intelligence perspective, or there's somewhere in the middle where you have very strict regulations and, managing traffic throughput from the public internet into the environment, or you're more public and you're able to distribute across multiple regions, particularly in Europe or the US, then it doesn't really matter. So sovereignty is all about requirements. And, when I talk about sovereignty at our events that we've run, I've always talked about it in the context of full legal jurisdiction over data. But when Amazon talk about that, and they, of course, are a lot at the moment, and when Microsoft talk about that, which, of course, they are a lot at the moment, it means something different. And it doesn't mean it's wrong. It doesn't mean it's not right or it's not sovereign. It just comes down to what the details are from the customer.
Yeah, I was just on a panel at a conference last week, and the whole discussion was around not so much sovereignty from a basic perspective, but data protection, data protection from a GDPR perspective, and everything else. Where you also have people who say it's like, under no circumstances can any hyperscaler actually provide you that. Where you say it's like, look, it's in the end, it's a risk analysis. You need to really closely look at like, what is your risk and what are the scenarios? Because that's also truth. If you look at some of the laws in some of the countries, it's like you basically very often have to decide whether you break one law or the other. For example, we had the scenario that for a certain time period in one of our data centers, we had highly protected data, which we had to store there for a project. So we had to have cameras outside of the building. In general, because there was a chance that they could see public space, that would actually be a GDPR violation. But the other law actually required us, because it was critical information, to actually protect the boundaries and everything else. In the end, then it's a risk discussion, which one actually is of higher scenario or anything else. And the other scenario when it comes to VCF, because I heard that quite a few times also in interviews in the last couple of weeks, is when people come and say it is still an American product. Where I go is like, yes, it is an American product. By the way, if we were to want to rule that out, it even gets very dark on the open source side because there's not much left. But even without that, is one of our customers, and it's a public case study in many cases, is German air traffic control, for example. And we had a very, very early on meeting beginning of 2024 after the Broadcom acquisition with Broadcom and the Broadcom legal team in Palo Alto to rule out all of these different scenarios of potential kill switches and all of these things, because you cannot operate as a European air traffic control organization a platform where, in theory, someone in the US can just press a button and say, it's like, you are now all grounded. I mean, that would be the dream scenario potentially for some military people, but that was exactly that discussion, and all of that could be ruled out within a matter of days, and all of that could be sorted. And that was not actually just like a paper tiger, like what some people say about data sovereignty is like there were liable people for German air traffic control looking into that, because that's also a business where if for whatever reason you were to take that completely down, you would not only affect Germany, you would basically affect Europe. And within, I think, a couple of hours, it would affect global air traffic whatsoever. And on top of all of that is like, none of the people up there in the air are actually prepared for the fact that information is gone, and that those systems wouldn't work. And so there are ways to operate that. There are ways to review that and to make that work. So an American product by itself does not make it bad. And I think VCF is exactly what brings back that control. As you said, it's like we have either as a public cloud provider, or, I mean, VMware now reduced the amount of providers, but it's also a good thing because the ones which are, at least the majority of the ones which are left, are clearly the ones who understand the VCF story, who can build the VCF story, who can give customers what they need. And in reality, when we talk about workload flexibility, and that's another good point, and maybe you can chime in on that one as well, VMware is the rare case where you have that, because I can take my private cloud, I can run it on-prem today, I can actually move it to a public cloud, I can build a hybrid model, and all of that with the same license model, with the same license system, on the same platform. There is no different edition, at least moving forward. We are currently still in a transition, but in, let's say, 2-3 years' time, what service providers are going to run is more or less, there is always slight, but it is 99 whatsoever percent identical to what enterprises are going to run.
Yeah, and coming back to a few of your points, you made the point around risk management. Everything to do with digital sovereignty is all around risk management, and I think the understanding of that is the first barrier that we have to address. Like you say, with your air traffic control example, for the critical national infrastructure, then VCF can run fully isolated with no callback home, no licensing requirement, etc., no licensing activation requirement, etc. You can have perpetual licenses for critical national infrastructure, and they just have to be approved. And that's, my understanding is, at least in the UK, we've never not approved one of those requests. So it is all about managing in that risk. And again, US, yes, but you can't isolate yourself in the world. The world is connected, whether you want it to be or not. And sovereignty isn't about isolation; it's about just control and managing risk. So the fact that the VMware and Broadcom is a US-based company is kind of irrelevant. Our engineering teams are in Sofia, they're in Bangalore, they're in the US, or multiple sites in the US. So we are a global company, but a registered business in the US. And what difference does that make? 83% of the software that's purchased inside of Europe is US based software. So we have to address that. And then your workload portability, absolutely. And I was with a customer just a couple of weeks ago here in the UK who had migrated to a cloud infrastructure. It was a public sector customer. In fact, they'd migrated off-prem into a cloud infrastructure. That agreement had ended and things had changed, and their strategy had changed, and we're then migrating back on-prem as a result of that. So, and these are almost zero impact migrations. We've seen with HCX and all those capabilities. Yes, there's operational changes, but actually migrating a workload from one data center to another, zero downtime, zero disruption from both a networking perspective, from an uptime perspective. So, it's quite a unique opportunity, quite a unique functionality to be able to do that. If you wanted to exit workloads out of AWS and move them into Azure, we know the complexity around doing that. both from a cost, from a risk perspective, from a disruption perspective. But moving from a VMware on-prem to a VMware in the cloud or vice versa is near zero impact, to the actual workload itself.
And I think that's an important point, because in the past, primarily VMC on AWS was the typical use case. People were using that to get into the cloud or out of the cloud. And we had all these restrictions on the local editions because HCX only came with NSX Enterprise or in some other bundles. And as much as everybody wanted to have it, it was as soon as the price tag came out, it's like, yeah, it's great that you have that feature set, but I'm not actually going to pay that much for that one because I'm not utilizing it often enough. And that's now also the beauty with VCF licensing, and all of these discussions have become so much easier because all of a sudden everything is there. It's like how many customers I had all over these years, whether it was CSPs or enterprises, like, yeah, we could really benefit from utilizing VCF operations or anything like that. And very often it was even in the original design. And then when it finally came to the production deployment and someone asked us, like, did everybody order everything? And then, we actually had to cut a few pieces, and operations was one of them, or NSX Enterprise, and you had to get away with standard or something like that. And I think we see a much bigger adoption now with VCF. Companies are seeing much more value out of it, because it's no longer the discussion whether you use it. It's like, it's the same. It's like you would currently not question if you were to go to Microsoft and just purchase a Word license. That's potentially hidden somewhere in their shop. You can find that, but no one is doing that, because only if you get all of the products together, it makes sense. And
I think that's probably one of the biggest things Broadcom has brought to the table, is that consolidation and simplification of our product portfolio. It is, beyond question, in the old VM world, and, we can sometimes look through things with rose-colored spectacles, but our go-to-market and our SKUs and our different licensing models were hugely challenging for customers. The whole, you mentioned about interoperability and the ability to have exactly the same thing running in cloud as on-prem. In reality, in the past, we weren't really doing that. Most cloud providers utilized Cloud Director. That limited HCX capabilities, or made HCX, much more challenging to consume. We had another product called VCD-A, which allowed you to do offline migration into Cloud Director and out again. So again, that product portfolio became really quite complicated. You had multiple products with overlapping use cases. And then defining those specifically for customers and for partners became just a lot of hard work. But as more and more customers move into the VCF 9 branch of code, and we get a much more stable sort of approach there, because in 9 and 9.1, you have to utilize all of these components. They're not optional any longer. Like they were with 5.2, you could still just utilize the baseline of components. But with 9.1 particularly, everything gets deployed, and you are going to have to utilize operations, automation, and other components within there for that platform. So I think as that happens, and as we get more and more adoption of 9 and 9.1, that true utopian vision of having complete workload portability will be realized with a much simpler operating model as well.
And I think, as you said, it's like VCF 9 also changed the way on how development looked at everything, because all of a sudden it was one product first. It was one platform first, and not actually, it is no longer important that something works standalone, which had become sometimes a nightmare. But now there is this, like, it's VCF, or there might be the subset with VVF, but in general, it's VCF first. And that's what everything builds towards, which also is like, when we look back with other vendors, is for many vendors, and that had always been kind of the tipping point, because as soon as you define that the integration first, and not just as a paper definition, because I remember VMware, we were always talking about that for years. It's like, yeah, all of these products integrated. That's the most important part. But reality is, it's like developers couldn't even agree on the same script language in many cases, let alone file formats and API formats. And I mean, you have been there long enough. It's like VCD migration plans for specific scenarios when it was between specific versions and NSX and everything else. It's like you could fill whiteboards with the amount of steps and checks.
Yeah,
Uh,
I spent a lot of my career at VMware doing that with whiteboard interoperability mapping between VCD, vSphere, NSX, and other components, and and the order in which you had to do those updates as well was crucial, and it became really, really complicated. And again, back to that simplicity, that life cycle management element of having one bundle to update, and almost automatically, to be fair, VCF, particularly with offline updates, takes that all out of your hands and is able to do the majority of that on its own. There's no real need to take downtime. We've got one bundle that will automatically, with JSON sitting in the back of it, automatically update each component in the correct order. And it just makes it makes operations much easier. It makes supporting, for Broadcom support and GSS support, makes it much easier to have that much simpler approach rather than having 10 different products that had different release cycles with different operational models, different updates. It was hugely challenging, and and to add to that, each of these different products, they had their own general manager and their own engineering team in Palo Alto, and they weren't incentivized around interoperability. That they weren't. They were incentivized to deliver a certain number of releases and build their pipeline, build their sales. But actually interoperating with the rest of the product suite was not something they were incentivized to do. Um, and that's something we tried to push. You may remember the whole office of the CTO, Chris Wolf and Joe Bagley and all of that. That was something we tried to drive through that initiative. Was that we're one company, when we're trying to make one suite of products, and everyone is off on their own, thinking their own strategies. Didn't worked, but not as efficiently as it could have worked.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting where we are now. I think what we are also seeing is the more and more customers are actually starting to use the new versions. The more and more feedback you get is yes, there are issues here and there. There were always issues on every product, and there is no software vendor which does not have any issues. I mean, that's reality. It's a new major release. There were major changes being done, and that can have impact. But I think the feedback from customers, it's like one statement which I got from one CIO a couple of weeks back is where he said is like, look, we were really confused with Broadcom in the beginning, and we really did not have that high of a hope. We just hoped that everything would stay. But now it feels like that finally VMware is listening to what we need as customers. We want to have all of this integrated as much as they love us as architects as well. Is like where they said is like, we want to actually focus to work with you on an IT architecture more towards availability and a lot of other factors, and not actually spend half of the budget just on trying to figure out which product combination can finally deliver what we want and how we want that, and then better ever never touch it and try to make an upgrade, which is also, I think, one of the legacies which we are still even seeing with VMware customers now is a lot of them are still on old versions. And that has nothing to do in many cases with them being lazy, but just because on one end, okay, it ran too stable. That's a good thing in the first place. But on the other side, it also had the complication that they said, it's like, it's so complex to get from A to B. We have that runs rock solid, so we don't want to touch it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That transition from a custom vSphere stack, if you like, into VCF, that has been challenging for many customers. Some less so, and some more so. But it is the end goal of where you're trying to get to is on a new branch of code, which is new and different, and is far more integrated than anything you would have operated before. So I think the journey is worthwhile. Some of them are doing that in a brownfield environment. Some are doing it in a greenfield environment. We've got all the challenges with the cost of hardware at the moment as well. So, I think Broadcom has done a great job in continuing to support older hardware versions as well. And that'll continue with 9.1. So obviously a lot of organizations finding hardware refresh is quite difficult. So therefore going to a greenfield environment, which is all clean and new, and migrating workloads in has been more challenging. But we are getting there with more and more customers, really seeing the benefits of VCF and developing, new operating models around all those tools we talked about earlier on that previously they would have loved to have had, but actually, were pretty expensive and all single individual SKUs and add-ons. Now you're getting all of that product all in one, and it's a single workflow to deploy it. You're not deploying individual products, any longer. You're deploying one builder appliance, and you're deploying everything else on top of that. And the automation is key to actually delivering a full end-to-end platform. And it is a game changer when you look at the comparable solutions out there. It is a game changer. And again, we see other vendors following our approach here with this single stack, this single platform.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a very important point, which is actually, from my perspective, currently not getting enough media attention. On one hand, the massive hardware price increase, I mean, that gets a lot of media attention. And it sounds like the more I speak to analysts, that's not shortly going to change again. But that is exactly where with VCF9 or VSphere 9, we have with, especially as memory is one of the most impacted factors, is like the memory tiering functionality we can now build in is making a huge difference for a lot of customers, because all of a sudden, because workloads are getting bigger. There's, especially as more and more products feature now local AI components, that is not only a GPU game, that is also a memory game in most cases. And that is one fact out of it. But the other part, as you mentioned, the latest announcement that the majority of vSphere 8 hardware was now certified on 9.0 and is most likely going to make it even into 9.1. That is a huge game changer for a lot of customers, because a lot of them said, it's like, yeah, we would want to have something different, but we are stuck here. We currently can't get that. We had a customer where we wanted to start a global rollout of VCF9 just before Christmas. And that was already delayed by 6 months because the hardware vendor didn't provide the hardware. And then even then we had delays in there. And we are a bit back to the times what we had throughout the pandemic, where basically getting a brand new server was basically easier, was sometimes harder than getting like a 911 GT3, where you normally wait 18 months on them. So it requires planning and stuff like that. But talking about features, I spoke about memory tiering. What is one of the most underrated features or something which people should look into as they go into VCF? Maybe one or two or three features where you would say is like, that is something which people either miss or don't pay enough attention to.
Yeah, and just to talk about memory tiering, absolutely, we've seen a huge interest in that capability now for the exact reasons around memory costs. And many applications are very static memory pages, and things don't change regularly, and no impact to performance. Having some of that memory being paged onto NVMe instead of DRAM. So I think that's I think it's a really interesting technology. The other thing I think that we're going to see growing adoption of is the Kubernetes layer with VCF. Again, I don't want to be too critical of old, VMware, but we didn't do a great job when it comes to Kubernetes and container platforms. We switched back and forward different solutions. We acquired Heptio, we acquired Pivotal, we acquired many other organizations, and the strategy really building a strategy out of these very contrasting types of organizations around containers and Kubernetes wasn't particularly successful. So Broadcom have absolutely doubled down on a single methodology for delivering Kubernetes on VCF, fully embedded into the hypervisor. The ecosystem of that is growing, on a daily basis. Of course, we are aware that we are a little bit late to the table here, on from a VCF perspective, but VKS, is a single strategy now, and we will build the ecosystem around VKS, and the customers will come and start adopting that. That ability to have both virtual machines, containers, AI workloads, database workloads, all on a single platform. That's a very compelling value proposition for many organizations.
And I would even argue late to the table potentially for companies which are 5 years or less in age. Let's face it, for many other companies, the whole storyline just starts because they see more and more software vendors giving them container form factors, Kubernetes form factors, and stuff like that. But let's face it, it's like we wouldn't have such huge complaints from customers all the time about Windows 2008 or 2003 going out of service if all of that would be modern, fancy container or Kubernetes-based applications, especially not only in Europe. We see the same in our US branch. It's like a lot of legacy applications are existing and they are moving from A to B. But now having VKS and the normal virtual machines on one platform is going to make even the investment protection for the customers even better, because you know that the platform where potentially today 90% of your workloads is VMs for legacy, if in 3 years' time that changes and you only have 40% VMs and 60% Kubernetes workloads, you don't have to change the platform anymore. You just actually change the workloads on top of it. And all of these are building blocks which basically undermine why the investment in VCF is definitely making sense. Whether you are a provider or you are an enterprise, it doesn't really make much of a difference. And all of these features actually add up to a storyline which certainly makes sense. And I think we will see more and more customers get through it. And also, what we hear on a daily basis is like we hear more and more customers thinking about coming back, because all of a sudden, sometimes you need to leave before you actually figure out what you lost. It's like,
the grass is always greener on the other side of the lake, isn't it? That's the conversation that I've certainly had with many customers and many partners. But there's no question the value VCF brings to the table, and I think everyone knows that. And yes, we've been through a little bit of a turbulent time over the last couple of years with the Broadcom acquisition, both internally and externally. Things have changed dramatically. From one type of business to a completely different type of operating model from Broadcom. So that has been visible externally as well. So it is absolutely now around stabilization, about risk management, about building trust, delivering on the promises we've made with 9.1 and 9.2 and 9.3, and then version 10 that'll come back after that. So I think engineering is delivering on those. We're seeing those. 9.1 is going to be it's not a small release. There's a huge amount of new capabilities coming in 9.1 in the next couple of months. So it's not a .1 release almost. It's almost like a new major release with all this multi-tenancy capability built in, and all the additional enhancements on storage and everything else. So I think as long as Broadcom keeps delivering, then customers will start, seeing the value, understanding the value, moving those legacy VMware vSphere environments into VCF. I get that that's challenging, and it does change things quite significantly. Hardware, software, operating models, everything does have to evolve. But once you're there, you are on a, you've got all of these capabilities on databases, but Kubernetes, container platforms, object storage that's coming in the next couple of releases. So you've got all of these things on a single private cloud platform that just gives you a lot of choice and flexibility about how you operate business.
Yep. I couldn't actually close this in a much better way. You basically summed it up and made everybody already wait for 9.1, but you don't need to wait for 9.1.
No.
You can also get started with 9.0 because the transition is going to be a lot easier. And I think we have a very, very interesting time with all of these features ahead of us. There is so much more to come. I have seen some quite interesting roadmaps from some parts as well. Thank you, Martin, for joining in today. And I think this is going to get our listeners a different perspective again on VCF, now a bit more from a cloud provider and sovereign perspective. Thank you for being here, Martin.
Thank you, Yves. My pleasure.